a man was trapped in the mud for days. What the lion did to save him, and the surprising ending, was beyond belief. I never thought I'd die in mud. Quicksand, maybe. Having seen enough movies, I feared that particular end, but thick, unrelenting African mud? That hadn't made my list of potential demises when I set out to photograph wildlife in Tanzania's Ruaha National Park. My name is Marcus Atwood. At 43, I'd spent nearly 2 decades as a wildlife photographer. My work had appeared in National Geographic, BBC Wildlife, and various conservation publications. My reputation was built on capturing intimate moments of predator-prey interactions, particularly with big cats. The irony that I might become prey myself was not lost on me as I lay trapped in that muddy pit, watching the sun set on my 3rd day of immobility. It had all begun innocently enough. The seasonal rains had created a network of watering holes throughout the park, drawing diverse wildlife to their edges. One particular spot had become a magnet for activity, a depression filled with water, surrounded by a flat expanse that allowed for unobstructed viewing. It was perfect for photography. I'd left the designated tourist trails, something experienced photographers occasionally do despite park regulations. My guide, Jabari, had warned against it, but I'd convinced him the risk was minimal. We would separate for just 2 hours. He would monitor a lion pride near the road while I captured the watering hole activity, then we'd rendezvous at the coordinates we'd established. 2 hours only, Marcus, Jabari had emphasized, and stay on the high ground. The mud near the water is treacherous after the rains. I'd nodded, already focused on assembling my equipment. The warning registered, but it didn't penetrate. I'd navigated difficult terrain countless times without incident. My confidence, built over years of successful expeditions, blinded me to the particular dangers of this landscape. The first hour had been productive. From my position on a slight rise, I'd captured remarkable images of elephants, zebras, and various antelope species coming to drink. When a family of warthogs arrived, I repositioned for a better angle, moving slightly closer to the water's edge. The ground seemed firm enough, though damp. What I didn't realize was that I was standing on what locals call crust mud, a deceptive layer of sun-dried soil covering a deep pocket of liquid clay beneath. One moment I was adjusting my telephoto lens. The next, I was thigh-deep in viscous mud that seemed to pull me downward with a living hunger. I didn't panic immediately. Getting stuck was an occupational hazard, and I'd extracted myself from difficult situations before. I attempted to distribute my weight to lever myself out using my camera tripod, but each movement seemed to sink me deeper. The mud now reached my waist, cold and unyielding against my struggling limbs. My satellite phone was in my backpack, on the ground where I'd left it, just beyond reach. The two-way radio was clipped to my belt, now submerged and useless. As the reality of my situation dawned, the first tendrils of fear began to wrap around my chest. By nightfall, I was trapped to mid-chest, my arms free but increasingly exhausted from failed attempts to extract myself. Temperatures in this region dropped significantly after dark, and hypothermia became a genuine concern as the cold mud leached warmth from my core. I called for help until my voice grew hoarse, knowing the chances of being heard were virtually non-existent in this isolated area. Jabari would look for me, of course, when I missed our rendezvous. But would he find me? We'd been deliberately vague about my exact destination, and the darkening sky would soon make search efforts impossible until morning. That first night remains a blur of discomfort, fear, and desperate strategizing. I drifted between alert panic and exhausted semi-consciousness. By dawn, my situation had worsened. The mud had pulled me deeper during my struggles, now reaching just below my shoulders. The rising sun brought no warmth, only the stark reality of my predicament and the beginning of dehydration's effects. Throughout that second day, my hopes rose and fell with each distant sound. A helicopter passed far to the east, park rangers, perhaps, but too distant to see me or hear my weakening shouts. Various animals approached the watering hole, regarding me with indifference or cautious curiosity before continuing their routines. Nature's callous neutrality had never felt so personal. By the second night, dehydration had become my primary tormentor. my lips cracked and bled. My tongue felt swollen, and coherent thought became increasingly difficult. I knew that the human body can survive roughly 3 days without water, placing my life expectancy somewhere around the following sunset, unless something changed. The mud had hardened slightly around my body, no longer pulling me deeper but now holding me in a vice-like grip that made even small movements impossible. The irony was bitter. I would die of thirst while imprisoned in mud created by water. Dawn of the third day brought the vultures, 3 of them at first, circling lazily overhead, their presence a grim testament to my deteriorating condition. They must have sensed my weakness, my proximity to death. In my increasingly delirious state, I found myself wondering if they would wait for me to die completely or begin their feast while I still drew breath. The African sun beat down mercilessly as morning progressed to afternoon. My exposed skin burned despite the cap I still wore, adding surface pain to the deeper aches of my imprisoned body. My swollen lips made breathing difficult, and my vision began to blur around the edges as dehydration advanced toward its final stages. It was in this condition, half-conscious, delirious, and resigned to my fate, that I first noticed the lion. He appeared at the watering hole's edge around mid-afternoon, a magnificent male with a dark mane that identified him as a mature, dominant predator in his prime. Through my deteriorating vision, I watched him drink, his powerful shoulders rippling with each movement. In my professional life, this would have been the photo opportunity of a lifetime. In my current circumstance, it potentially represented the violent end to my suffering. The lion finished drinking and raised his head, droplets of water clinging to his muzzle as he scanned his surroundings. When his amber gaze settled on me, I felt a surge of primal fear cut through my delirium. Predators are particularly attuned to vulnerability, and nothing could be more vulnerable than my current state. He approached with deliberate caution, each padded step bringing him closer to where I was imprisoned. I had no illusions about my chances if he chose to attack. I couldn't even raise my arms in a futile defensive gesture. My body was simply too weak, too firmly trapped. At approximately 20 feet away, he stopped, nostrils flaring as he processed my scent. I waited for him to charge, to end my suffering with teeth and claws. Instead, he sat on his haunches, regarding me with what I could only anthropomorphize as curiosity. For nearly an hour, the lion remained in that position, occasionally shifting his weight but never taking his eyes off me. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, marking what I believed would be my final sunset, he rose and approached closer. I closed my eyes, preparing for pain, for the end. What happened instead would challenge everything I thought I understood about these apex predators and ultimately change the course of my life, if I survived to have a future at all. A warm, rough sensation against my cheek caused my eyes to flutter open. The lion stood directly beside me, close enough that I could feel his breath, his massive paw pressing against the hardened mud near my shoulder. He wasn't attacking. He appeared to be investigating. What followed defies rational explanation. The lion began to paw at the dried mud surrounding my right side, his powerful claws breaking through the hardened surface layer. He worked with what seemed like deliberate care, occasionally glancing at my face as if gauging my reaction. Was this simply predatory behavior, preparing access to trapped prey? Was I hallucinating in my final hours, creating a comforting fantasy as my brain surrendered to dehydration? Or was I witnessing something unprecedented, something that would challenge fundamental assumptions about predator behavior? As consciousness began to slip away, the sun setting on what I believed would be the final day of my life, I felt the pressure around my right arm lessen slightly. The lion had broken through some of the hardened mud, creating a small pocket of movement where none had existed before. My last conscious thought before darkness claimed me was a question that would haunt researchers and wildlife experts in the months to come. Why would a wild lion, an apex predator with no evolutionary reason to help a human, appear to be trying to free me from the mud that had become my prison? The answer, when it finally emerged, would prove more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. Consciousness returned in fragments. First, sound, the distinctive whooping call of a hyena somewhere in the distance. Then, sensation, the uncomfortable stiffness of my imprisoned limbs. Finally, sight as my eyelids fluttered open to reveal a star-filled African sky. I was alive, though I couldn't immediately understand how or why. The lion was still there. In the silvery moonlight, his massive form was silhouetted against the night sky as he continued to work at the mud around my right shoulder and arm. The dried surface had cracked under his persistent efforts, creating a network of fissures that had loosened the mud's grip slightly. Not enough for escape, but enough that I could feel blood circulating to my fingertips again. As my awareness sharpened, questions flooded my dehydrated mind. Why hadn't he killed me? What could possibly motivate a wild predator to behave this way? And most pressingly, was this actually happening? Or was I experiencing the vivid hallucinations that sometimes precede death? The lion paused in his efforts, amber eyes reflecting moonlight as he regarded me. Up close, I could see a distinctive scar running across his muzzle, an old wound that had healed into a pale line cutting through his otherwise perfect features. He made a soft chuffing sound, a vocalization typically used between lions as a non-threatening greeting, before returning to his methodical pawing at the mud. Through the night, he alternated between working at the hardened clay and resting beside me, his warm body surprisingly close to mine. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my survival instincts warring with the physical realities of extreme dehydration. Each time I woke, the lion was still there, still working with what seemed like purpose. By dawn, something remarkable had happened. My right arm was free to the elbow. The lion's persistent digging had broken through enough of the hardened surface that I could now move the limb slightly. It wasn't enough for self-rescue, but it represented the first change in my circumstance since becoming trapped. As morning light strengthened, I expected the lion to retreat. Large predators typically avoid the heat of the day, seeking shade to conserve energy. Instead, he continued his efforts, now focusing on the mud around my left side. The sun rose higher, bringing punishing heat that exacerbated my dehydration. My tongue felt swollen, my thoughts increasingly disjointed as vital fluids continued to leach from my system. Midway through the morning, the lion suddenly tensed, his attention shifting to something beyond my field of vision. A low growl rumbled from his chest, a warning sound I recognized from years of observation. With surprising speed, he positioned himself between me and whatever had triggered his defensive response. From my limited vantage point, I couldn't see what had caused this reaction until they moved into view, 3 hyenas approaching the watering hole, their characteristic hunched posture betraying their opportunistic nature. They'd likely been attracted by my weakened state, perhaps tracking my scent or the lion's movements. What followed was a textbook demonstration of predator dynamics. The lion charged the hyenas with a roar that seemed to shake the very air, driving them back from the water's edge. Rather than retreat completely, they circled at a distance, calling to each other in their eerie vocalizations. They were waiting, I realized through my delirium. Waiting for the lion to leave or for me to die, whichever came first. For the next several hours, this tense standoff continued. The lion would alternate between guarding against the persistent hyenas and returning to work at the mud around my imprisoned body. By midday, the progress was undeniable. Both my arms were now free to the shoulder, though the rest of me remained firmly trapped. With enormous effort, I managed to use my newly freed right arm to reach toward the watering hole just a few tortuous feet away. The movement sent pain shooting through atrophied muscles, but the motivation was primal. Water meant survival, even if just for a few hours longer. My fingertips brushed the muddy liquid at the edge of the pool. Ignoring everything I knew about untreated water and waterborne diseases, I managed to scoop some toward my cracked lips. The first moisture to touch my tongue in nearly 4 days tasted like life itself, despite the silt and impurities. The lion watched this desperate effort, his expression unreadable. When I'd managed to consume a small amount of the life-giving liquid, he returned to his methodical work on the mud. With my faculties marginally improved by hydration, I began to notice patterns in his behavior. He wasn't digging randomly, but seemed to focus on creating lines of weakness in the dried surface, his powerful claws following the natural cracks that had formed under the sun's heat. As afternoon waned, an unexpected sound cut through my semi-delirious state, the distant but unmistakable rumble of a vehicle's engine. Someone was approaching. The lion heard it too, his head lifting, ears pivoting toward the sound. Hope surged through me, temporarily overriding the pain and exhaustion. I attempted to call out, but my voice emerged as little more than a rasp, inaudible beyond a few feet. The vehicle's sound grew louder, then stopped, still out of sight, but close enough that I could occasionally hear voices carried on the wind. The lion's behavior changed dramatically. He intensified his efforts, now digging with what seemed like urgency, his powerful forelegs throwing chunks of dried mud aside. Within minutes, he had cleared significant material from around my upper body. For the first time, I felt the compression around my chest lessen slightly. Through my dehydrated haze, I realized he was responding to the human presence, not with the typical avoidance wild lions show toward humans, but with what appeared to be recognition that they represented potential help. This behavior defied everything I thought I understood about wild predator psychology. The voices grew closer, more distinct. I recognized Jabari's distinctive cadence among them, calling my name. With tremendous effort, I raised my free arm and waved it weakly above the level of the surrounding grass. Here, I managed to croak, the sound barely carrying. The lion, remarkably, added his voice to mine, a deep, resonant roar that echoed across the landscape. It was the first full vocalization he'd made since beginning his inexplicable efforts to free me, and its effect was immediate. The voices stopped, then resumed with increased urgency. They had heard him, if not me. Minutes later, Jabari's face appeared above me, his expression transforming from professional concern to shock as he took in the scene, me half freed from the mud, a massive male lion standing just feet away. "Don't shoot." I managed to gasp as I saw the park rangers behind him raise their rifles. "He's helping." Disbelief crossed their faces. But Jabari, who had worked with wildlife long enough to recognize the extraordinary when he saw it, signaled the rangers to lower their weapons. "The lion is not attacking," he confirmed, his voice tight with controlled amazement. "He appears to be digging him out." What followed was a rescue operation unlike any recorded in the park's history. While the lion retreated to a watchful distance of about 50 yards, the rescue team worked to free me from the mud that had nearly become my tomb. The process took nearly 2 hours, even with proper equipment and multiple strong men pulling me from the suction-like grip. By sunset, I was on a stretcher being loaded into a medical evacuation helicopter, severely dehydrated, suffering from exposure, muscle damage, and the early stages of kidney failure, but alive. As the helicopter lifted off, I insisted on being positioned so I could see through the window. The lion remained at his observation point, watching the aircraft until it disappeared from sight. My physical recovery at the hospital in Dar es Salaam took weeks. The medical team had never treated a case quite like mine. Few people survived 4 days trapped in mud without water. The damage to my muscles and kidneys was significant, but not permanent. More difficult to address were the psychological aspects, the trauma of the ordeal, combined with the cognitive dissonance of having been apparently saved by a creature that should, by all natural law, have seen me as prey. While I recovered, my story spread, first among the park staff, then to wildlife researchers, and eventually to international media. Most greeted it with understandable skepticism. Predators don't save humans. It contradicts every evolutionary adaptation that has shaped their behavior over millions of years. The prevailing theory was that I had hallucinated the lion's helpful behavior, constructing a comforting narrative while in a dehydration-induced delirium. But Jabari and the rangers had seen it with their own eyes, a male lion that had clearly been working to free me from the mud, that had positioned himself between me and scavenging hyenas, that had retreated without aggression when humans arrived to complete the rescue. Their testimony prevented my account from being dismissed entirely, though scientific explanations remained elusive. 2 months after my rescue, having regained enough strength to travel, I returned to Ruaha National Park. The compulsion to understand what had happened drove me past reasonable caution. Jabari opposed my return but eventually agreed to accompany me under strict conditions. We would remain in the vehicle at all times, carry satellite communications, and be accompanied by armed rangers. The seasonal landscape had changed significantly. The watering hole where I'd nearly died had shrunk considerably, though evidence of my ordeal remained visible in the hardened mud. We positioned our vehicle at a respectful distance, powerful telephoto lenses ready to document any wildlife activity. On the third day of our watch, he appeared. The same male lion, identifiable by the distinctive scar across his muzzle. He emerged from the tall grass with the confident stride of an apex predator in his prime, approaching the water's edge to drink. When he finished, he raised his head and looked directly toward our vehicle, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. What happened next was captured on video that would later be analyzed by wildlife behaviorists worldwide. The lion deliberately approached our vehicle, not with the cautious assessment typical of wild lions encountering humans, but with what could only be described as recognition. He stopped approximately 20 yards away, sitting on his haunches in a pose reminiscent of our time together in the mud. For nearly an hour, he remained in that position, occasionally making soft chuffing sounds, the same non-threatening vocalization he had used during my rescue. Then, with the same deliberate dignity with which he had arrived, he rose and disappeared back into the grassland. The video evidence silenced many skeptics, though it raised more questions than it answered. Why would a wild lion behave this way? What could possibly explain a predator apparently choosing to help rather than harm a vulnerable human? As my strength returned and my story spread, researchers from around the world contacted me seeking to understand this aberration in predator behavior. Among them was Dr. Amara Enosi, a Kenyan-born ethologist specializing in carnivore cognition at Oxford University. Her theory would eventually provide the framework for understanding the extraordinary events that had transpired and would lead to discoveries that would challenge fundamental assumptions about animal cognition and behavior. Dr. Amara Enosi arrived at Ruaha National Park 3 weeks after my return, bringing sophisticated field equipment and a team of researchers specializing in animal cognition. Her hypothesis, while controversial within traditional wildlife biology circles, offered the first scientifically plausible explanation for the lion's behavior. What you experienced may represent a previously undocumented form of interspecies recognition, she explained as we sat reviewing the video footage. There are rare documented cases of predators sparing humans who have removed painful thorns or snares, but active assistance of the kind you describe is unprecedented. Her team established observation blinds near the watering hole, using state-of-the-art recording equipment to document the lion's movements and behavior patterns. They named him Jabali, strong as rock in Swahili, though I privately continued to think of him simply as my lion, a designation that felt simultaneously presumptuous and profound. Dr. Enosi's research methodology included reviewing the park's historical records, which revealed something extraordinary. 3 years earlier, a conservation team had rescued a young male lion cub whose mother had been killed by poachers. The cub had been rehabilitated at a nearby sanctuary before being released back into the wild once mature. The records included photographs showing a distinctive injury to the cub's muzzle sustained during the poaching incident that had killed his mother. The scar pattern matches, Dr. Enosi confirmed, comparing the archival images to our recent footage. It's the same lion. The implications were staggering. Jabali had experienced human intervention at a formative age. Humans had saved him when he was vulnerable. While conventional wildlife biology would suggest this experience should be forgotten once the animal returned to the wild, Dr. Enosi proposed an alternative view. Recent research in elephant cognition has demonstrated multi-decade memory for specific human interactions, both positive and negative, she explained. We've documented elephants returning to human settlements seeking medical help for injuries. What if certain big cats possess similar capabilities that we've simply failed to recognize because the circumstances for demonstration are so rare? Over the following months, a remarkable research initiative took shape. Using carefully designed observational protocols, Dr. Enosi's team documented Jabali's behavior patterns, comparing them with other lions in the region. While he maintained normal territorial and hunting behaviors, his responses to human presence showed subtle but significant differences. Rather than displaying the typical avoidance or occasional confrontation characteristic of wild lions, he exhibited what researchers termed neutral assessment, observing human activity with neither fear nor aggression. More remarkably, on 3 separate occasions over an 18-month period, park rangers documented Jabali approaching injured animals at watering holes, not to prey upon them, as would be expected, but apparently to investigate their condition. In one case, he was observed sitting near a young elephant with a leg injury for several hours before moving on. The behavior defied conventional predator-prey dynamics. For my part, I remained involved with the research while resuming my photography career, though with a radically shifted focus. Rather than seeking dramatic predation images, I now documented subtle interactions and expressions that might reveal cognitive complexity in wildlife. My near-death experience had transformed not just my understanding of these animals, but my approach to representing them through my work. The scientific papers that emerged from Dr. Inosi's research generated intense debate within wildlife biology circles. Traditional ethologists argued that attributing such complex cognitive processing to lions risked anthropomorphizing, projecting human motivations onto animal behavior. Yet the documented evidence proved difficult to explain through conventional behavioral models. 3 years after my rescue, the research took an unexpected turn when a second incident occurred in Serengeti National Park, approximately 600 kilometers away. A field researcher studying cheetah populations became stranded when her vehicle broke down in an isolated area. After 2 days without contact, a search team located her unharmed and in the company of a male lion that had apparently remained with her throughout the ordeal, keeping other predators at bay. DNA analysis would later confirm something extraordinary. This lion was Jabali's biological brother from the same litter rescued after the poaching incident. Like Jabali, he had been rehabilitated as a cub before being released in a different region once mature. The implications were profound. If both lions exhibited similar protective behavior toward vulnerable humans, it suggested something beyond random aberration. Dr. Inosi's team hypothesized that the early positive interaction with humans during a formative developmental period had created a lasting cognitive framework that transferred to their adult lives. Essentially, they had learned that humans could be allies rather than threats or prey. The documentary film that eventually emerged from this research, titled The Lion's Debt, became one of the most viewed wildlife features in National Geographic's history. It presented not just the dramatic story of my rescue, but the broader scientific implications for our understanding of predator cognition and behavior. For the conservation community, these discoveries created both opportunities and ethical dilemmas. If certain large predators possessed greater cognitive flexibility than previously recognized, it opened new possibilities for human-wildlife coexistence. Yet, it also raised difficult questions about wildlife management practices and the ethics of rehabilitation and release programs. On a personal level, my relationship with Jabali developed into something unprecedented in documented human-wildlife interaction. While maintaining appropriate distance and scientific protocols, I was permitted to establish a regular observation routine when in the park. During these sessions, Jabali would often approach to a distance of approximately 20 yards, sometimes lying down to watch me work for hours at a time. Dr. Inosi's team documented these interactions meticulously, noting that his behavior toward me specifically differed from his responses to other humans. With others, he maintained a greater distance and showed more typical wariness. With me, he displayed what researchers termed affiliative recognition, behavior patterns normally reserved for familiar members of his own species. He remembers you, Dr. Inosi concluded after months of observation. Not just as a human who once needed help, but as a specific individual with whom he shares a unique history. 5 years after my rescue, Jabali remained a dominant territorial male in Ruaha, now with a pride of his own, 5 females and numerous cubs across several generations. The research project had evolved into a long-term study of lion cognition and social behavior, with findings that continued to challenge conventional understanding of these magnificent predators. The most remarkable development came during my 8th return visit to the park. By this time, Jabali was showing signs of age, his once dark mane now threaded with gray, his powerful body bearing the scars of territorial conflicts and hunts. I'd established a viewing blind near one of his pride's regular resting areas, with permission to remain for extended observation periods. On the 3rd morning, he appeared with 2 nearly mature cubs, young males approximately 2 years old, identifiable as his offspring by their distinctive facial features and emerging mane patterns. What happened next was captured on video that would eventually be featured in scientific journals worldwide. Jabali led the young males directly toward my blind, stopping at his usual distance of about 20 yards. The cubs, normally cautious around human structures, followed his lead. For nearly 10 minutes, the three lions remained in position, the cubs occasionally glancing between their father and the blind, as if trying to understand the significance of this unusual behavior. Dr. Inosi's team, analyzing the footage, proposed a stunning interpretation. Jabali appeared to be deliberately introducing his offspring to me, teaching them that this particular human represented no threat. It suggested a level of social learning and intentional knowledge transfer previously undocumented in wild lions. The scientific implications continued to expand as similar observations emerged from other regions and species. Researchers documented elephants distinguishing between different human groups based on past interactions, orcas demonstrating selective responses to specific boats and individuals, and great apes showing recognition of particular humans years after separation. A new field of study emerged at the intersection of conservation biology and cognitive science, examining how early experiences shape lifetime behavioral patterns in large mammals. The traditional view of instinct-driven wildlife yielded to a more nuanced understanding of animal cognition, one that recognized the capacity for memory, discrimination, and even forms of gratitude that transcended species boundaries. For conservation efforts worldwide, these discoveries proved transformative. The traditional separation between humans and wildlife gave way to more integrated approaches that recognized the cognitive capabilities of the animals we sought to protect. Rehabilitation programs incorporated new protocols designed to maintain appropriate wariness of humans while allowing for the positive imprinting that might someday benefit both species. As for my personal journey, the mud that had nearly claimed my life ultimately gave me a new one. My near-death experience and subsequent relationship with Jabali transformed not just my career, but my fundamental understanding of the creatures with whom we share this planet. My photography now focuses exclusively on documenting animal cognition and emotion, using visual storytelling to help others recognize the complex inner lives of species we have often underestimated. 10 years after being trapped in that muddy pit, I returned once more to Ruaha. Jabali was in his final years by then, his territory reduced but still respected by younger males who seemed to recognize his unique status. During my 2-week stay, he appeared at my observation point just once, moving more slowly but still with the dignity that had always characterized him. He settled at his customary distance, amber eyes meeting mine across the space between us. For nearly an hour, we regarded each other in what felt like mutual recognition of a connection that defied conventional understanding. Then, with deliberate movements that spoke of age and wisdom, he rose and disappeared into the tall grass for what would be the final time. Park rangers found him 3 months later, lying peacefully under an acacia tree, the natural end to a life that had challenged our understanding of what it means to be wild. At Dr. Inosi's recommendation, and with unprecedented permission from park authorities, he was buried rather than left for scavengers. A small stone marker records not just his role in scientific discovery, but the life he had saved through inexplicable compassion. The academic papers, documentary films, and conservation protocols that emerged from our extraordinary interaction continue to influence wildlife management worldwide. The Jabali protocols for predator rehabilitation now incorporate recognition of cognitive capabilities previously unacknowledged in conservation planning. Research into animal memory and recognition has expanded dramatically, revealing capabilities that blur the traditional boundaries between instinct and intelligence. But beyond the scientific implications, beyond the conservation impacts, what remains most profound is the simple, inexplicable reality: a wild lion chose to save a human life when all natural instinct should have dictated otherwise. In doing so, he not only rescued me from certain death, but opened a window into the complex inner lives of creatures we have often viewed as simply other. Scientists continue to debate the precise neurological and evolutionary explanations for Jabali's behavior. Was it a form of reciprocal altruism triggered by his early experience with human rescuers? Was it an example of cross-species empathy that emerged from cognitive capabilities we're only beginning to understand? Or was it something even more fundamental about mammalian brain structures and their capacity for connection beyond species boundaries? these questions may never be fully answered. But for those of us who witnessed Jabali's extraordinary life, who saw the look in his eyes when he recognized a specific human, who documented his apparent teaching of his offspring, the experience transcended clinical analysis. In conservation work, in wildlife photography, we're taught to maintain objective distance, to avoid anthropomorphizing the animals we study. This professional boundary serves important purposes, preventing misinterpretation and maintaining appropriate separation. Yet sometimes this scientific caution might cause us to overlook genuine cognitive and emotional capabilities in the creatures we observe. What Jabali taught us, what my mud-trapped desperation and his inexplicable intervention revealed, is that the boundaries between species may be more permeable than we've allowed ourselves to recognize. That perhaps, in rare and extraordinary circumstances, the capacity for recognition, for memory, for something we might cautiously term compassion, can transcend the divisions we've constructed between human and wild. The mud that nearly became my grave instead became the foundation for a new understanding of the magnificent predators with whom we share this planet. And perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the lion who saved me comes from Dr. Inosi's concluding remarks in her definitive paper on the case. What we witnessed was not the absence of wildness, but rather its fullest expression. A demonstration that to be truly wild is not to be bound by our limited expectations, but to possess the freedom to act beyond them. In that freedom, Jabali showed us not just what lions are, but what they can be.